بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin in the name of God and we beseech him to send his peace and blessings upon our noble messenger and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and upon his family and upon his companions and upon all of those who walk in his path with excellence until the last day. So assalamu alaikum, welcome back from the break, and inshallah it was a good break and everybody is rested somewhat and ready to be very confused today. So we left off last time we spoke. We ended with this section of Imam al-Ghazālī's deliverance from error, the Munqidh min al-Dhalal, looking at the section on kalam and the mutakallimun and the modality of the mutakallimun. So just to recap, just a kind of a quick summary, inshallah, of that section. Kalam for Imam al-Ghazālī, as he says in that section, brings about a type of proof. It's a type of proof. And that is sufficient, he says, to take one out of taqlid and to establish the proper epistemological foundations that it seeks to verify insofar as its main doctrines are concerned, right? But as he says, it doesn't take one the entire way, i.e. it's not fully demonstrative in that sense. But also, as he says, it doesn't claim itself to be. So what the mutakallimun of Ahl Sunnah claim is that there are certain assents, tasdiqat, confirmations, like the existence of God, which cannot be dependent on revelation, because something which you know through revelation can only be known to be true once you've demonstrated the existence of God and the veracity of prophethood. And this obviously is going to depend on one using pure reason, the intellect, in order for one to actually come into those realizations. He says once that's established, the only condition that the mutakallimun make is that the things that we know from revelation cannot negate what we have come to know through rational sources. And they don't, right? By the way, they don't. Now, the whole of theology cannot be known by the intellect alone, which is then where revelatory knowledge comes in. Like, for example, angels exist and heaven and hell are real and the last day is real and predestination or qadr. And that's where Imam al-Ghazālī says it's not complete in and of itself to allow for one to have that type of demonstrative certainty in all of the facets of metaphysical inquiry. In other words, it's not providing a methodology to uncover all of the truths about reality. And that's what he assumes exists, and perhaps will bring about a sort of completion, maybe, perhaps, to what kalam simply lays the framework for. Right? But this in no way is al-Ghazālī positing, as some suggest, that kalam is unnecessary, or that it's ineffective in achieving what it sets out to do, or that the intellect and pure reason are insufficient in demonstrating the veracity of the truth of Islam. It's absolutely not true. The mutakallimun's primary concern was not to arrive at a complete theoretical knowledge of the world. It looked to examine, as Ghazālī says, existence, qua existence, one can say, every knowable entity as it comes to be known later. It looks to examine every knowable entity insofar as they relate to affirming the veracity of Islamic truth claims and setting a foundation for Muslim life, right? And those things that the aql is incapable of arriving at is complete vis-a-vis revelation, right? But that doesn't mean, by the way, that those things that we get from revelation are somehow irrational. It's not irrational, like belief in angels and heaven and hell and the sirat and the mizan, etc. These things are not irrational things. All right. I was talking to somebody once, and that was one of their concerns, that it seems like in order for me to be religious, I have to believe in all these irrational things. And I said, no, you don't have to believe in irrational things. These dogmas or these creedal beliefs like heaven and hell and angels and whatnot, these are things that we would call supra-rational. They're not irrational, they're supra-rational, and that's an important distinction. Irrational is that which is inconceivable to the mind, i.e., a contradiction arises from its assumption. Like, for example, if I say something like, imagine a square circle. Imagine a square circle. Right? You can't. Or imagine a human being who's not a human being. Right? In other words, that's not something that is even conceivable to the mind. Whereas supra-rational is that which pure reason cannot derive in and of itself, but is perfectly conceivable to the mind. Okay, like for instance, heaven will have rivers that flow, and the existence of a buraq, this particular kind of animal or beast that one can use to traverse into the seven heavens. Or that Munkar and Nakir are two angels that exist who will confront you when you die and ask you, who is your Lord, who was your prophet, and what is your religion? So these are things that are not irrational. These are things that are super-rational, meaning that the mind, the intellect, the unmediated intellect is not capable of arriving at those conclusions in and of itself. But those conclusions are not things that the mind cannot actually conceive of. All right. And this is extremely important, particularly when we get into these types of theological discussions. Now, Imam al-Ghazālī, from here, okay, turns to philosophy, falsafa. And he makes his intentions clear as to why in his introduction. He says, he read and mastered the discipline until he became seen, as he says, as a master in it by even the philosophers themselves, in order that he understands the granular issues, the granular concepts of the discipline, so that his judgment of it would be precise. And in other words, it wouldn't be void of accounting for anything. And so he expounds upon what he finds in his study, and he presents it then, and he actually presents the gist of it in the title of the section here. So he says, القول في حاصل الفلسفة. القول في حاصل الفلسفة وما يذم منها وما لا يذم وما يكفر فيه قائله وما لا يكفر ولكن يبدع فيه وبيان ما سرقوه من كلام أهل الحق ومزجوه بكلامهم لتزويج باطلهم في درج ذلك وكيفية حصول نفرة النفوس من ذلك الحق وكيفية استخلاص صراف الحقائق الحق الخالص من الزيف والبهرج من جملة كلامهم. All of that, by the way, was the title of the section. So he says basically on the gist of philosophy, what is blameworthy about it and what is not blameworthy, what doctrines lay its proponent open to the charge of unbelief, and what doctrines lay him open to the charge not of unbelief but of innovation, and a presentation of what the philosophers have stolen from the positions of the people of truth and conflated it with their own affirmations to promote the circulation of their own errors together with those of truth, and how souls come to feel a dissonance for those truths, and how to extract the unadulterated truth from amid the counterfeit and spurious views found in the philosopher's teachings. So that's the title of the section. And Imam al-Ghazālī here shows that there are a variety of aspects to the philosophers and their methodology. They're not necessarily all the same. And he's obviously condensing this down from his larger work, the Hafd al-Falasifa, or the Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he goes into much more depth, right? So in that text, he, in it, he emphasizes which of their beliefs led to anathema or kufr, and which of them were simply deficient or ajaz. That, the methodology that they are deploying and the conclusions that they reach, he says, are incomplete. Like, you can't actually reach this conclusion using this methodology. That's what he tries to go about showing. So then he begins this section. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. ثم إني ابتدأت بعد الفراغ من علم الكلام بعلم الفلسفة، وعلمت يقينا أنه لا يقف على فساد نوع من العلوم من لا يقف على منتهى ذلك العلم حتى يساوي علمهم في أصل ذلك العلم، ثم يزيد عليه ويجاوز درجتها، فيطلع على ما لم يطلع عليه صاحب العلم من غور وغائلة، فإذ ذاك يمكن أن يكون ما يدعيه من فساده حقا. After finishing the science of Kalam, I then started on philosophy. And I knew, he says, I knew for sure that one cannot recognize what is unsound in any of the sciences or any of the disciplines unless they have a grasp of the farthest reaches of that discipline. And that he is, or she is, the equal of the most learned of those versed in the principles of that very science. And then he must even excel. He must even excel those who are seen as the most learned of that science and attain even greater eminence, so that he becomes cognizant of the granular issues and the profundities which have remained beyond the ken of the acknowledged master of the science. Then and only then will it be possible that the unsoundness that he alleges will actually be seen. Okay. And this, in many ways, one can say, is it's the epitome of what Imam al-Ghazālī is known for in terms of his methodological approach. All right. So he says, similarly, he is going to explicate on what aspects he was able to sift from the methodology of the philosophers, which are things that are sound in and of themselves, and those things which they themselves may have used and derived from sound sources. But in order to actually do that, what Imam al-Ghazālī is saying here, and in order to refute those things that we don't agree with, one has to actually know the science. In order to refute something, you have to properly ascertain the knowledge itself and engage it and be peer reviewed in the discipline itself, such that those in the field recognize your scholarship. And then from there, he says, refute it. He even goes as far as saying, you have to surpass that. You have to be even better than the best of those in the field. And this is really a long way from the type of refutations that we see in our day. But there's also a real concern from the community of Muslims to enable that level of scholarship and to enable that type of work to be done. So they saw, obviously, the real benefit that comes from it. Now, one of the things that I forgot to mention here is, both in terms of now Imam al-Ghazālī's approach to this, he's saying, look, I'm going to refute the philosophers. He doesn't start off that way. He obviously is starting off by simply just trying to learn what this discipline is about, what their objectives are, what's going on. And he also recognizes that there are concepts within the science that he knows are going to be beneficial, or that he can sift from the science that are going to be beneficial. And, what's interesting is when we talk about falsafa, just in general, maybe this might have been a better preface to have. when we talk about falsafa or philosophy today in the contemporary period, it's become kind of a taboo almost in certain circles. And in other circles, it's become seen as kind of the epitome of knowledge. What Imam al-Ghazālī is saying is that, look, it's neither. The group of philosophers that he is dealing with, who had a strong impact on the Muslim world in his time, had made serious errors. And he is going to show you what those errors are. And at the same time, there are methods being deployed by them that he said were being used by them and are beneficial, and they strengthen our intellectual pursuits as Muslims. So there's actually no harm in using them, so long as we're cognizant of what they are and how they are to be used. Okay. And this again requires that an individual who delves into something like this has a profound grasp on what the discipline is and how to use it. ولم أرى أحدا من علماء الإسلام صرف عنايته وهمته إلى ذلك، ولم يكن في كتب المتكلمين من كلامهم حيث اشتغلوا بالرد عليهم إلى كلمات معدودة مبددة ظاهرة التناقض والفساد، ولا يظن الاغترار بها لغافل عامي فضلا عما يدعي دقائق العلوم. So I noted, however, that not a single Muslim scholar had directed their attention to that end. And what the mutakallimin had done, what they posited in their books, where they were engaged in refuting the philosophers, was nothing but obscure and scattered remarks, and inconsistent sometimes and false, and could not conceivably fool even an ordinary intelligent person, to say nothing of one familiar with the subtleties of the philosophical sciences. So basically, there isn't anyone that I've seen or any work that I've seen who have really properly refuted the obfuscations that have come about from this group. And again, you can see the similarities here when we think about, for instance, evolution today, or many of the other things out there. I mean, I know we talk about evolution a lot, but there are a number of issues, philosophical ones and otherwise, that have become extremely dangerous insofar as the impact that it's having on the Muslim mind, right? The worldview of the modern day Muslim. And the issue with the actual problem that we face is not that those things exist, but rather that there's no proper response to any of those things in the manner that actually goes about refuting them properly, right? And you know, alhamdulillah, I would say that there's a lot of work being done, a lot of really good work being done. I know a lot of people who have taken on certain types of issues, particularly in evolution, science. Science seems to be a very big deal today, sort of the natural sciences, and its effect that it's having on many people in terms of how they think about religion. A lot of it too is simply just an appropriation that we as Muslims have swallowed whole, in a sense, because of the way in which that discourse, science and religion, has played out in Europe and amongst Christians. And so we assume, on the basis of that and on the basis of, you know, Christianity in the contemporary period, sort of the European history being the paradigmatic the paradigmatic representation of the world, almost in a sense, in terms of how we think and thought in general. This issue has now become an Islamic issue, right? And we assume that the same issues that Christians faced with the particular history that they had in Europe are also things that we as Muslims have to answer for. And I would say that that becomes part of the sifting process, right? That has to be done first and foremost. Did we have an issue when it came to science insofar as how our religious discourse played out? Like, did the issues that Europe faced insofar as Galileo and the advent of the Copernican revolution and what's so, are those things that Muslims themselves also had the same type of history, the same types of struggles with? The answer, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely not. Doesn't mean that there aren't any issues, it just means that that's not the issue that Muslims had. And so it behooves us to properly conceptualize what happened within our own tradition insofar as some of these issues are concerned, and think about then what the proper response is going to be. And then in doing so, to do it in a way that properly establishes the very basis of the refutation to be something that is accepted, right? Sometimes people are going to accept it, sometimes people are not going to accept it. But if you've done your due diligence, it means that you have properly engaged these things the right way. And that's what Imam al-Ghazālī rahimahullah ta'ala is actually saying here. So he says, علمت أن رد هذا المذهب قبل فهمه والاطلاع على كنهه رمي في عناية. So I realized that trying to refute this particular way, the philosophical tradition, okay, the philosophers, to try to refute them before properly establishing myself as an authority, one can say, or properly grasping and engaging in this discourse insofar as being recognized or peer-reviewed as someone who knows it, is me basically taking a shot in the dark. All right. فشمرت عن ساق الجد في تحصيل ذلك العلم من الكتب بمجرد مطالعتي من غير استعانة بأستاذ ومعلم، وأقبلت على ذلك في أوقات فراغي من التدريس والتصنيف في العلوم الشرعية، وأنا ممنون بالتدريس والإفادة ل300 نفر من الطلبة ببغداد. So he basically says, I got to work learning that science by examining the writings of the philosophers without seeking the help of any teachers. And I devoted myself to that in the moments that I had free from writing and lecturing on the legal sciences. And I was then burdened at the time with having to teach 300 students in Baghdad. So he's basically saying, like, I learned it in my free time, and I had to because I didn't really have that much time because I had a job and I was doing other things. So I had to basically master all of philosophy on my own. And he says that I did it without a teacher. Now, this is interesting because, you know, what do we say? You know, it's always something that you've probably heard me say. You've probably heard Sheikh Jamel and Sheikh Muslim say it, which is that to go about trying to learn these disciplines without a teacher is synonymous with you not really being able to learn the discipline, right? In other words, those who try and learn things simply by reading books are probably not going to grasp it properly. And so one always has to read with a teacher, and you constantly hear people saying you have to read with teachers, you have to have an isnad for the things that you read. And here's Ghazali saying, look, I mastered philosophy on my own. I didn't have any teachers or masters. So what do we say of this? What we say of this is the following. That concept, when we say that those who simply try to learn from books are not really learning properly what the discipline is saying, we're saying it to those who are beginners in the disciplines that they're actually trying to read in or to understand. And a person who has established a proper foundation and has been given the tools in order that they properly know how to go about critically investigating these sciences, these individuals are not individuals who we're saying have to go read with, you know, the masters of that discipline. Now you could, but it's not something that's like limiting you in your capacity to be able to properly discern what's going on and to critically engage it. this is also something that I think is extremely important because, you know, oftentimes you can overplay the idea of how one goes about seeking knowledge, and that seeking knowledge almost becomes this like insurmountable thing. Like I can't do it because, you know, in order for me to do it, I have to go to this remote place in the middle of nowhere to find this individual to do it with. And if I don't find that individual, then I don't really have a way of learning the science. And so I just can't do it. No. There are things that an individual needs to learn, and they need to learn them with teachers. And once they've been given that foundation from there, their teacher oftentimes will tell them, go read the things that you need to read. And if you have any questions, come and ask me, right? And we've seen that, and we've heard that from our teachers and people constantly who recognize that you do have the capacity to critically engage these texts, and that you have a strong enough foundation to be able to do so without losing your way through them. And when you've been given those tools, when you have that type of foundation, Bismillah, you know, and so long as your intention is sound, inshallah, you'll be given tawfiq in it. So that's how to make sense of this particular issue. Also, you begin to see like just the pure genius of Imam al-Ghazālī, someone who mastered philosophy in 2 years in his spare time, right? He says, in his spare time. فأطلعني الله سبحانه وتعالى بمجرد المطالعة في هذه الأوقات المختلسة على منتهى علومهم في أقل من سنتين. This is, I mean, I knew that he had done it in 2 years, but this is actually where he says I did it in 2 years, right? I devoted myself through by, you know, reading in these moments that I had free, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me insight into the farthest reaches of the philosophers of science, these concepts, in 2 years. ثم لا أزل أواظب على التفكر فيه بعد فهمه قريبا من سنة، أعاوده وأردده وأتفقد غوائله وأغواره حتى اطلعت على ما فيه من خداع وتلبيس وتحقيق وتخيل اطلاعا لم أشك فيه. And then, having understood their doctrine, I continued to reflect strongly on it for nearly a year, coming back to it constantly and repeatedly re-examining its intricacies. And finally, I had become so familiar with the measure of its deceit and its deception, as well as its precision and its delusion, that I had no doubt about my grasp of the science itself. فاسمع الآن حكاية مذهبهم وحاصل علومهم، فإني رأيتهم أصنافا ورأيت علومهم أقساما، وهم على كثرة أصنافهم تلزمهم وسمة الكفر والإلحاد، وإن كان بين القدماء منهم والأقدمين وبين الأواخر منهم والأوائل تفاوت عظيم في البعد عن الحق والقرب منه. So hear me now, hear my account of the philosophers in my report of the essence of their science. For I observed that they fell into several categories and noted that their sciences included several divisions. But to all of them, despite the multiplicity of their categories, has the stigma of, it leaves one with the stigma of unbelief and godlessness. Yet there is a marked difference between the older and the oldest of them and the more recent and the earlier in their distance from and closeness to the truth. Right? So in other words, like we said before, they're not all the same, and not everything that they are discussing or the methodologies, the methods that they're deploying are all bad. Okay. So it's very important to be able to discern which of them are which. And this is why he goes into then talking about the main categories of the philosophers, right? So he says, فصل في أصنافهم وشمول سمة الكفر كافتهم. The categories of the philosophers and the stigma of unbelief that is common with all of them. All right. So this is this section. Are there any questions though? Because I feel like I've been talking and I don't even know if like everybody okay?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, I think so.
Okay. Okay, so then he says, اعلم أنهم على كثرة فرقهم واختلاف مذاهبهم ينقسمون إلى 3 أقسام الدهريون والطبيعيون والإلهيون. Right, so know that the philosophers, notwithstanding the multiplicity of their groups and the diversity of their doctrines, can be divided into 3 main groups. The Duhriyun, or the Dahriyun, which are the materialists, the Tabi'iyun, who are the naturalists, and then the Ilahiyun, which are, it says theists here, as what Mark McCarthy translates as. I would say maybe better to say like metaphysicians. Okay. So the first category, the first category, الدهريون وهم طائفة من الأقدمين جحدوا الصانع المدبر العالم القادر وزعموا أن العالم لم يزل موجودا كذلك بنفسه لا بصانع ولم يزل الحيوان من نطفة والنطفة من حيوان كذلك كان وكذلك يكون أزلا وأبدا وهؤلاء هم الزنادقة. So the first group are the materialists, and he says, and these are a group of the most ancient philosophers who denied the existence of an omniscient and an omnipotent creator. And they allege that the world actually has existed from eternity as it is in and of itself, and not by way of any creator or any maker. And animals have unceasingly come from seed and seed from animals, and thus it was, and in that way it will always be. And he says these are the godless in the full sense of the term. These are the godless in the full sense of the term. This category as well, the materialists recognize, basically the position for them is that, look, we're here, the world obviously exists as it is, but how does it exist? Well, they just say it's always existed, and that these things, us, all of creation, have, in a sense, created ourselves. All right. In what way have they created themselves? They don't really have much of an explanation outside of simply trying to look at the sort of the mere causes, right? Insofar as the way that the world is structured itself. And it's a type of sophistry, obviously. It's a type of safsata, circular reasoning. You ask them, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? He said, well, the egg. Okay, well then how did the egg get there? He said, well, the chicken. You can't have it both ways, but they're fine constantly doing that. And in a sense, what's interesting about this is that they deny the idea of an omniscient, all-knowing, and an all-powerful creator, right? And this becomes kind of the point of dissension for us as Muslims, is that we believe that the world exists in the way that it does, and that it goes back to its creator, but that creator is one who has all knowledge and all power, and the attributes, obviously, of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah that we affirm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way that we affirm them. And we recognize those things as being necessary in order for one to properly establish that all of this was created. Whereas they want to posit that all of those things exist in us, in a sense, in the world itself. And the proof that they show is no proof. So that is this first group. He then says, الصنف الثاني الطبيعيون. The next group are the naturalists. وهم قوم أكثر بحثهم عن عالم الطبيعة. They were people who devoted a lot of their study to the world of nature, basically, nature. وعن عجائب الحيوان والنبات وأكثر الخوض في علم تشريع أعضاء الحيوانات. فرأوا فيها من عجائب صنع الله تعالى وبدائع حكمته ما اضطروا معه إلى اعتراف بفاطر حكيم مطلع على غاية الأمور ومقاصدها. They devoted study of nature and the marvels found in animals and in plants, and they were also very much taken up with like dissecting animal organs. In these, they saw such marvels of God subhanahu wa ta'ala making and such wonders of his wisdom that they were compelled with that in mind to acknowledge the existence of a wise creator, cognizant of the aims and purposes of all things. So these are individuals who are more or less studying the world insofar as physics is concerned, one can say, okay? And they do actually, as al-Ghazālī is pointing here, they do see it as coming from a creator, and they marvel at the wisdoms, right, that these things actually have. So it seems like so far so good. ولا يطالع التشريح وعجائب منافع الأعضاء مطالع إلا ويحصل له هذا العلم الضروري بكمال تدبير الباني لبنية الحيوان لا سيما بنية الإنسان إلا أن هؤلاء لكثرة بحثهم عن الطبيعة ظهر عندهم لاعتدال المزاج تأثير عظيم في قوام قوي الحيوان به فظنوا أن القوة العاقلة من الإنسان تابعة لمزاجه أيضا وأنها تبطل ببطلان مزاجه فينعدم. So indeed, no one can study the science of anatomy and the marvels that one sees in the uses of the organs that we have as creatures without acquiring this compelling knowledge of the perfect governance of the one who shaped the structures of animals and especially that of man. However, it appeared that these philosophers, because they had studied nature so much, that the equilibrium of the mixture of humors had a great effect on the resulting constitution of these animals' powers. So they thought that man's rational power was also dependent on the mixture of his humors, and that its corruption would follow the corruption of the mixture of his humors, and so that power would cease to exist. Okay. And it says, ثم إذا انعدم فلا يعقل إعادة المعدوم كما زعموا فذهبوا إلى أن النفس تموت ولا تعود فجحدوا الآخرة وأنكروا الجنة والنار والحشر والنشر والقيامة والحساب فلم يبقى عندهم للطاعة ثواب ولا للمعصية عقاب فانحل عنهم اللجام وانهمكوا في الشهوات انهماك الأنعام وهؤلاء أيضا زنادقة لأن أصل الإيمان هو الإيمان بالله واليوم الآخر وهؤلاء جحدوا اليوم الآخر وإن آمنوا بالله تعالى وصفاته. Okay. So once it ceased to exist for them, they alleged that bringing back the non-existent would be unintelligible. So they adopted the view that the soul dies, never to return, and consequently they denied the afterlife, and they rejected the garden and the fire and the assembly and the recall and the resurrection and the reckoning. So in their view, there would be no future reward for obedience and no punishment for disobedience. Therefore, they lost all restraint and they abandoned themselves to their passions like beasts, like animals. These were also godless people because basic faith is belief in God and the last day. And these are people who denied the last day, even though they believed in God and his attributes. Right. So I want to try to parse this, okay, a little bit. Is anybody confused? No? So what is it, what exactly is Imam al-Ghazālī saying here when it comes to this particular group? He says, look, this particular group began simply insofar as an investigation into physics, basically, okay, into and in physics, you know, when we look at philosophy, it's comprised of theoretical sciences or theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. The first of the two theoretical sciences is physics, and physics in the Greek tradition, as well as the Islamic tradition, is the study of the natural body as it undergoes change. Okay, so it provides you a cosmological worldview in which disciplines like astronomy is then deployed to explain this worldview mathematically. All right. So physics aims to tell you what the structure of the universe is. And so for the philosopher, the idea for them was that this world is limited, that it's circular, there's no elliptical motion, and they're going to have various arguments to explain for why this is also philosophically consistent for them. So basically physics is seen as any discipline that is mainly interested in exploring the essential characteristics as they undergo change. Now, insofar as bodies are concerned, that which is in motion, they say either animate or inanimate. Animate bodies are plants and animals and humans, right? Now, each one has certain faculties, quwwa or quwwat, potentialities that allow changes to take place. And these faculties are the principles that allow for the possibility of change. So for instance, when we look at plants, the faculty, the quwwa or the nafs, okay, the quwwa, the faculty of plants is that of growth and reproduction. When we look at animals, the quwwa there is movement by will and sensory perception. And in humans, it's intellect. Now, it's not to say that humans don't have movement by will and sensory perception and growth and reproduction. They actually have all of them. So, you know, they have all these parts, but humans are distinguishable in that they are able to be rational. Okay, so the genus, and the what's known as the fossil, okay, gives you the essence of a thing. Okay, so the human, they say, is a rational animal, that which distinguishes it from other animals insofar as it's animate, it has life, okay, and it moves by will and has sensory perception and can reproduce and grow. Well, what makes it different than animals? What makes it different than animals is that it has an intellect, has a rational capacity. So the way that the philosopher saw it was that the perfect human beings are supposed to align their souls such that rationality sits on the top. So your reason should rule over your other faculties, i.e. to grow and to reproduce and to move, and your senses and so on. So humans' internal organization of the soul, focusing on abstract things for philosophers, intellecting and then turning away from the body, for turning away from that physical aspect of the self, brings you actually closer towards your nature. And it's in view of that, in their ethics, that they're going to talk about how your household is going to be in line, and that has a greater impact on society and the macro perspective on all these things. Now, what's interesting about this is that Muslims, and this is what Imam al-Ghazālī is going to show, Muslims are actually going to adopt a lot of that structure. The one thing that they're not going to adopt, though, is that, and this is where the philosophers go wrong, what Imam al-Ghazālī says they go wrong in, is that they begin to assume that it's these things, okay, it's this schema, one can say, by which we have a certain type of, we are comprised of a particular humor, okay, that allows for us to understand what things are and how things must behave. And that those things are the reasons why everything happens. Right? In other words, they've become so steeped into the marvel and the wisdoms by which they see the world being moving, okay, that they assume that it is the things in themselves that are moving them, right? The human being, as they would come to see, is comprised of certain types of faculties, like we just said before, okay? And within those faculties, and generally speaking, one can say it is the intellect, and then you have the animal soul and the plant soul, okay? There's other ways of thinking about this as well, but we'll just leave it at that. What they begin to say is that each individual is constituted a particular constitution, and it is in their ability to recognize that and to balance that and to come into harmony with that which is around them that will allow for the human being to ultimately discern all things through this sort of process of intellection and their connection with the way that the world is structured. And so what this does is it no longer, God is no longer in the picture. You don't need God. Why? Because you have created an explanation as to why everything exists the way that it does and behaves the way that it does, insofar as what that thing is in and of itself. And you've created this really grand sort of philosophical narrative to help buttress that particular position. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? So I have something that says, so in this thought process, the person becomes enslaved by their own intellect. It's a very good way of putting it. Yes, they become enslaved by their own intellect in a sense, right? Because they assume that it is the intellect that ultimately is bringing about one's not only realization of all things, but that within those things themselves, there is a type of process that the human being undergoes with the object that brings about a full knowledge of what this thing is and how it must behave. And so everything around you can be explained through these natural causes. All right. Now, there is a very grand sort of eschatological scenario that the philosophers hold. But he's saying that, Imam al-Ghazālī rahimahullah ta'ala is saying that it's in this very basic framework that allows for the philosophers to deny then the very notion of hell being real and heaven being real and all of these things being real. Even prophets for them. I mean, when we look at prophets, for instance, a prophet for the falasifa is someone who is the most astute and refined and sophisticated philosopher, like somebody who's doing this process of intellection and, like I said before, being able to tame their lower selves in this fashion and connecting to the outside of the sublunar world into the lunar world. They're connecting to the active intellect, and that brings about these types of realizations. So The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, for them, was not someone who needed to go through the same types of discursive processes that you and I do. Okay, like if I give you a math problem in calculus and it's a very difficult one, you might have a proof for 4 pages because you're going through this discursive process and so on, etc. But if you gave this calculus problem to a prophet who is a true philosopher, so he has this connection to the active intellect, he just knows it. And he knows the 4 pages of proofs and the conclusion in no time, right? And actually in unified time, as they'll say, and he'll know all of reality all of the time, as opposed to us who are constantly striving. Sometimes we are able to make connections, sometimes, and it unveils realities to us, and sometimes it doesn't. But prophets are highly advanced philosophers, so they have this capacity, right? And that's what a prophet is in this schematic. So you have this naturalistic way of explaining what actually happened to the prophet. Was he actually speaking to the angel Gabriel, who was giving him direct messages from God? Well, not really. What was happening was the angel Gabriel, and again, they say that this is through the faculty of imagination. We won't get too into it, but it's this highly developed faculty where the actual physical things appear. Okay, so the Falasifa will say that yes, Muhammad actually saw Gabriel, but it's because his faculty of imagination was so highly developed that he could actually see these ideas in a physical form. And for them, Jibril is this active intellect. Like they actually say that the active intellect is an abstract thing, which is thinking abstractness all the time, or the intellect, which is constantly intellecting, is the same as Gabriel, the active intellect. And that is what the Prophet Muhammad was actually in connection with. So he's a philosopher of the highest grade. The angel is not really an angel in that sense. The heaven and hell are not real. Like, the soul that's going to go on to the last day and meet the Lord and be paradise and go to paradise or hell. What they say is, well, the suffering that is akin to the suffering of a person who, while he was in this world, was not training him or herself to transcend the world, i.e. someone who's not thinking about abstract notions and they're always bogged down by their vegetative and animal soul. When they arrive at this last day and they come to this place in the afterlife, they have a memory, and that memory is attached to the lower world, and so it cannot enjoy its connection to God. So it's this intellectual connection with God at that moment, right? The reward is that all of abstract things and the reality of everything forever. But in other words, you become subsumed back to the source of all emanation, and that's their understanding of paradise and hell. So it's this proximity that one has to God, or farness from God. Okay, it's not like paradise and hell are real places. No, these are metaphors in a sense that ultimately are used to try and help the laity. Really, they would mean like the stupid, right? The people that need these kinds of stories in order to be motivated to do stuff. But in reality, what is paradise? In reality, what is hell? Well, they're simply just a proximity or a farness from your intellectual connection with God. Now, that's obviously problematic for Ahl Sunnah, right? And this interpretation of scripture is the way in which these philosophers are then going to kind of move about. So, inshallah, that is the naturalists in a kind of very quick summary. We'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll continue next week with the last, where the metaphysicians or the theists in the last category. Any questions?
Assalamu alaikum. From the second category, naturalist, you did mention a few scholars within the Islamic philosophical tradition or the philosopher. Whom were you referring to, or who are who was who was a philosopher you mentioned as an example?
So I don't think that he gets into giving examples of particular people. I mean, he is going to talk about people, but that doesn't happen yet.
All right. So who would be? Would this be someone like Ibn Sina or uh, Ibn Rushd, or whom? Ibn Rushd came after him, but is that the category we're looking at here?
So yeah, this is he's going to talk about Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and al-Farabi, for instance. After this, he's also going to trace them back to their sort of Greek heritage, so like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Is my video like? Can everybody see me properly, or is there?
No, it's really there's a lag or something.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know why it's doing that. Yeah, this is he's going to talk about Ibn Sina. And I'm hearing in the background something. Okay. Firas says it's okay. It looks cool. So yeah, these particular individuals like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and whatnot, he's going to talk about in the category that comes afterwards. He doesn't give any examples of particular people, but yes, obviously these concepts are things that are going to be associated to Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi in different ways, though, right? In different ways. So there's a question here from Zareen. Says, so because they can be corrupt, they shouldn't be brought back to life? I don't know if I understand that. Oh, she left? Okay. Back again, not sure what's going on with the... It's a very strange effect going on here. But, you know, maybe it's because we're talking about the philosophers. Right? Any other questions, comments? And, you know, again, it's okay if all of this isn't something that you grasp, but, you know, Imam al-Ghazālī is trying to simplify it. And, you know, what we want to try and come out of all of this with ultimately is simply an understanding of the different types of concepts and ideas that he is investigating, what he finds in them, why he sees them as problematic. And this is extremely important because you'll find that these same types of ideas sort of resurface again and again. And in our day and age, these ideas have resurfaced amongst various philosophical and religious traditions or spiritual traditions. And so it's very important that people have an understanding of what these things are and why they are problematic and false insofar as the way in which our theology deconstructs them. So we'll talk more about this. If you have questions, you can think about, you know, the lesson today, and then we'll come back next week, inshallah, and try to have more of a discussion just so that I know everybody's on the same page and we'll move forward. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.